I'm Shelley Welty, and I'm the program director of the Trauma, Stress, and Resilience program here at the Utah Center for Evidence-Based Treatment. And over the past few months, I've been doing some reading and reflecting on this idea of vicarious resilience and considering ways in which it already shows up in my work and ways where I can grow in this area. As we talk today, I'll talk through the origins of this concept. It's a fairly new concept that's come into the trauma world. We'll talk about different areas of study that are integrated into this concept, some of the dominant themes that show up in the research on vicarious resilience. And then we'll end by thinking through some reflection questions that can help us to be more mindful of maybe this process at work already in our work, or maybe how it can be more present in our work. As I talk through the presentation, I want to honor the original research, which was done with therapists who were working with survivors of torture. So even though we'll talk about ways that we can pull from this work, some of us, that may be in work with traumatized populations. Some of us may do some work with survivors, people who have come from other countries, who have survived some really difficult political situations. Or we may think about how we can use it in lots of different contexts in our work. But then I want to also hold a space for the fact that this research really was done on survivors of torture and the therapists who work with them. And so as we translate some of that and we take what we need for our own work, I do want to hold the fact that that is the group of people who has really provided this concept for us. All right, I'm getting some indication that I need to change my presentation. So give me one moment. Okay, I think that should work. So the origins of this concept really started, as I said, with survivors of torture. These three researchers, Hernandez, Gangsey, and Engstrom, had been doing some work looking at the effects of vicarious traumatization on therapists working in the field. And as they were doing some interviews with therapists, this comments kept coming up about how therapists were so inspired by their clients, how their lives had been affected in really positive ways by this really difficult work with survivors of torture. And so these researchers became really interested in learning more about these positive effects that were taking place. And they began by interviewing 12 psychotherapists who worked specifically with victims of political violence and kidnapping at a torture treatment center. And that center was the Survivors of Torture International in Bogota, Colombia. And in 2007, they published the results of that original study. And I have put all of their findings here. I know this is everything you're not supposed to do on a PowerPoint slide, and I'm not going to read through all of it. I'll let you do that on your own. But they were really just kind of throwing their net wide. What would show up if, they looked for the positive effects of this work on therapists? And I will point out just a few that will show up throughout the studies that they did. This idea that it caused therapists to reassess the significance of their own problems. There was consistently a reordering of therapists' priorities, their perspective on life. And right below that, the idea that of incorporating spirituality as a valuable dimension in treatment. This will come up repeatedly in the findings throughout the years. That therapists would comment that they initially in their work would discount the role of spirituality or even see that as maybe a negative to their clients, but over the course of their work found that this was actually a very important piece of clients' culture, community, history, identity that really help them to maintain hope and to persevere. And then further down, articulating personal and professional positions regarding political violence. This also is a recurring theme that these therapists, and again, these are therapists working specifically with torture victims, found that their work made it impossible for them to remain neutral about political systems and the violence that's taking place in the world, and to find ways to advocate and take action on that. And then further down, this idea of using community interventions, of really working often with others in the community, certainly understanding the community background of different individuals, understanding more about the cultural pieces of clients' understandings of both healing and trauma. And a big part of what they pointed out in this paper, because again, they had been working with vicarious traumatization prior to this, they really wanted to note that it seemed clear that vicarious traumatization and vicarious resilience um, live together in us often, that we can have both occurring at the same time. I'll say more about that in a second. But because of the results of their research, they came to believe that this really is a new concept, something that that maybe we've understood elements of it before, but this is something worth spending more time on, really understanding more about the way our clients, particularly those who have been through traumatic events, can really positively influence us. And so they say, we advance, based on the data, we advance the idea that a specific resilience process occurs as a result of psychotherapists' work with trauma survivors, vicarious resilience. This process is characterized by a unique and positive effect that transforms therapists in response to client trauma survivors' own resiliency. So this was kind of their first stand on this is something important, and we need to, as therapists, come to understand this better. And really to go back to what I was referring to, this coexistence of vicarious traumatization with vicarious resilience, this concept is a really important balance to what we have learned a lot about, I think, especially as we work with trauma survivors often, is that we have to be very cautious about the natural bent in our, day after day hearing trauma stories, that we will naturally bend toward feeling some of the effects of that traumatization ourselves, that we can become cynical and lose optimism and maybe even have some physical symptoms to that. And that's something we as therapists have to be mindful of and really conscientiously work toward balance. And they would say, the authors are saying, there's also this positive bent, this direction that our clients will often pull us toward, that can help us to manage that uh, negative direction that we are sometimes pulled, by really being attentive to and conscious of the perseverance, the strength, the optimism that clients who have been through really difficult life circumstances continue to exhibit. And so just as uh, traumatized clients live in that tension between resilience and trauma response, we as therapists can hold both of those at the same time. So because of this finding, they decided, let's follow up on this and see what more we can learn about this concept. So they conducted a follow-up study with the same interview, this time again with about 12 therapists uh, at a torture treatment center in San Diego. So this time the center was located in the US, but the clients were from all over the world. And from this study, found they kind of grouped the findings into three main themes: that therapists are being positively affected by the resilience of their clients. That was um, a certainty. That the therapists experience an alteration of their own perspectives on their own lives. And they found ways to value the therapy maybe even more than they did before, maybe in ways that they had not experienced before. And I would say, I guess, before I move on, I want to point out that in this study, the authors wanted to make sure that there was a clear delineation between post-traumatic growth and vicarious resilience. So they pointed out the fact that post-traumatic growth, for one thing, refers specifically to clients. That is not a term that is applied to the therapist. But in that case, in post-traumatic growth, clients are uh, seen to grow in some ways in spite of the trauma because of what they've learned from the trauma, maybe changes in relationships, changes in their perspective on their lives, um, changes in the goals that they have, recognition of their own strengths. And generally it's understood that there would be even, it would be perceived that clients often uh, function above their previous baseline, that post-trauma, there are ways in which they function better than they did beforehand. And vicarious resilience has some similarities to that, but one big difference is it refers specifically to the therapist. Vicarious resilience does not ever refer to the client. And it really refers to the therapist's growth and resilience. It's, the therapists are not enduring a trauma like the clients have, but they are picking up maybe ideas for growth in their own resilience, but they're also, it's not expected that there would be an increase in functioning above their previous state prior to working with that client. So there are some important differences between those two terms that the authors of this study made sure to discuss. And over the course of the years, this beginning in 2007, um, there has been more research done on vicarious resilience, more thinking, of course, and theorizing. And over the course of time, there have really, it's understood to include, to really integrate 4 different areas of clinical research, theory, and practice. So as we think about what do we want to take from the research on this concept, how can we integrate it into our own work, whether that's with trauma clients or clients who are experiencing other challenges in their lives. It's good to remember that this encompasses not just the resilience piece, but also some of these other areas of research. So the first of these is the vicarious impact of survivor stories and experiences on us as therapists. And this includes vicarious traumatization, which I've referred to already, but just to be clear on what exactly that means, vicarious traumatization is generally understood as this gradual negative shift in thinking in therapists over the course of our careers. So it's a gradual thing that happens over the course of time in therapists' thinking, general perspective on the world, and it's perceived as a negative effect. Secondary traumatic stress really has to do with us picking up, us as helpers, picking up some of the actual symptoms of PTSD. So some of those ways of maybe difficulty sleeping or reacting in a more vigilant way, um, some of our shifts in thinking, even about ourselves. And then compassion fatigue is really a um, work related term, and it combines the effects of secondary traumatic stress with the work piece. So just feeling tired of our work, feeling burned out on the work, in combination with some probably physical symptoms like fatigue or um, irritability, difficulty sleeping. So these are all pieces that fit into this area of research. And then the second area would be the field of resilience. And I don't know if you feel this way, but when people refer to resilience, I feel like, wow, that's a lot of things. And it's hard to pin down what exactly is resilience, even though I feel like I've done a lot of reading on it and presenting on it. It has a lot of pieces. And so for me, I think I've settled on a definition that works well enough for me, that resilience is really a pattern of responding to life that keeps us in a positive mindset, that keeps our bodies moving well, that um, regardless of any really major challenges in life, moves us in a positive way. uh, and also prepares us for really difficult challenges in our life, keeps us in a general state of wellness that makes it easier for us to kind of adjust to difficult circumstances, which I would say is a little different from stress management, which is a reactive um, behavior or mindset to something really stressful comes my way and I find ways to manage it for the moment, where resilience would be more a general life orientation, habits, mindset, practices. The third area is the field of study around politically motivated violence, which includes things like kidnapping, disappearance, assassination, torture, other forms of persecution. So people who are working with survivors of torture, people coming from very violent political systems, therapists who work in that field are also well versed in how some of these systems work, particularly in the countries or communities that their clients have come from. And I think, trying to, as I said, honor that is an area of this work that is specifically to that work. And yet, as we translate that to our work, we can be thoughtful about what are the systems at work in our clients' lives that make their lives more difficult, that sometimes have targeted them, have discriminated against them, and keeping that systems mentality as part of our thinking. Which moves nicely into this last area of research on issues of equity, culture, and international trauma work, that as we work with people from all different cultures, um, we have to be mindful that other cultures, other communities, people think differently about healing, and really being thoughtful about how we can collaborate with clients, understand those concepts from other perspectives than our own often, and work out of that context. And I think we can, again, translating that into our work, even if we don't work specifically with victims of torture, our clients come from all kinds of different lands, right? Like different communities, different ways of understanding life. Uh, we could think of them as coming from sometimes foreign lands as far as how I see the world, and always keeping ourselves flexible in understanding the world in different ways. So I have a question from the chat. I see, can I discuss ways in which clients function better after the trauma? And this is referring to post-traumatic growth. There are ways in which sometimes going through really healing from a traumatic event where clients reevaluate uh, the way their relationships functioned before, the goals they were pursuing before. Trauma is kind of it's a jarring experience. And the recovery out of that, healing from that traumatic event, often opens up space for people to think about lots of things in different ways, to have to reevaluate their own identity, their own place in the world in general, in different ways. So it is true, you know, in the face of tragedy, sometimes there are some positive things that come out of that, that um, in some ways people can function at a higher level afterward. Thank you for that question. So I want to just take a minute, you know, I keep referring back to the origins of this concept, and just think about, why is it important for us? If this came from a specific set of studies around victims of torture, not all of us do that work, not all of us work with trauma for that matter, why would it be important for us to think about this? And the authors in this work do refer to this, and I think it's worth taking a second to reflect on, why are we talking about this? You know, what am I hoping to get from this? So it's a useful tool, obviously, for all of us. Uh, we all do difficult work. And like I said before, we're always trying to bend more in the direction of resilience than in the direction of traumatization. So it is a concept that reminds us to be mindful, to look for certain pieces in the work while we're with our clients. It provides greater awareness of these processes so that it can provide avenues to strengthen therapist motivation and persistence, just helping us make choices, you know, really think about what does keep me going, you know, thinking about how our clients have persevered and persisted. How can I be persistent toward the type of work that I really want to do for the rest of my career? I have to be mindful about how I think about the work, how I experience my clients, how I function outside of the work. We also want this, you know, we want to incorporate this type of resilience work into our training and supervision. Just as I think there is at least movement toward making therapists more and more aware of the traumatization that we can experience vicariously, we need to be really thoughtful about helping newer therapists think about how to look for resilience in the work. Thinking about, what can we learn from our clients? You know, we have crises in our lives at times. What can I learn from my clients that will be useful in my life? I am learning in the process of helping. And also the authors point out that these clients, particularly these survivors of torture, are often quite aware of how difficult it is for people to hear their stories and express to their therapist the concern that they have for the therapist in listening to this story. And so, you know, as appropriate, it may be helpful for clients to understand this idea of vicarious resilience so that some of that concern can be modified to an extent that, you know, I think it's respectful to say that um, I am affected in positive ways from my interactions with my clients. I learn from them in ways, and I'm an expert in ways that are helpful to them. So we help each other in some ways. And it can also really enrich, kind of broaden our ideas about how we do the work, ways that we might want to grow in the work, understanding systems better, understanding political ideologies better, and how that might show up in different ways that we advocate or research, or different ways that we do the work. Now, in 2016, there was another major research study done, again, with therapists working with survivors of torture. That is always the population that they're looking at. And in this, they had fine-tuned, the concept's been around long enough at that point that they could ask more specific questions to the therapist. They could bring in more of this integration from different areas of work. And they learned more information about this idea of vicarious resilience through this particular study. And they were able to frame this learning as four major themes that they came away with. So I'm going to review all of these because I think at this point, later in the study of the concept, the learning, the themes that emerge are more extensive. They're more helpful to us to think through. So the first is a change in the therapist's self-perception and general outlook on the world. And this tended to break into the ideas of reframing the therapist's personal issues. So helping therapists put things in perspective, hearing other people's stories, hearing how they've overcome, hearing what they've overcome, help therapists maybe reorder, reprioritize some things in their own lives. Therapists noted a generally greater sense of patience in their lives, feeling less need to be in control, more relaxed in general. They quoted one therapist who talked about their shift in traffic, that suddenly sitting in traffic for a little while just didn't seem like as big a deal as it used to. Having a more informed worldview. So in working, in this situation with survivors from all over the world, from different countries and political systems, it's necessary to have a more informed understanding of what is happening in the world and how are those issues, those events affecting different populations of people, which I think is important for us also. Our clients come from all over the world, from all kinds of different backgrounds, and are affected by the world in different ways. And therapists, really in line with all of this, redefined what was important to them. A second major theme was, I mentioned early that spirituality came up in the very first study, that therapists often experienced an altered spirituality in their own lives. And there was no set definition that therapists gave for this idea. Generally, a movement away from organized religion toward more meditative or open experiences of connection with others in the world. But there was definitely a movement toward a greater spirituality in their own lives. Sometimes they frame this as a response to the evil in the world, trying to find a balance or even something stronger than the evil that they heard in stories all day long. And some actually just framed it as the work itself is a spiritual practice, that they felt like this was a practice that connected them in ways to the world, the universe, in ways that were really important to them. The third theme that showed up were modified thoughts about self-care. And the researchers pointed out that many therapists already highly valued self-care and had really leaned into that a great deal. And yet they did mention that they did better about respecting their work boundaries, containing the work, and they intentionally learned from clients. They listened to clients' ways of dealing with their challenges and sometimes picked up some of those habits themselves. And the fourth theme that showed up really had to do with the work itself. New views on trauma work and on ways of connecting with clients. So these therapists noted pretty consistently that there was a real shift in their understanding of their role. They worked much more intentionally on meeting clients where they were and not feeling like they had to have as much control, really trying to collaborate with clients, understanding more about the client's cultural history, their life history, and how that played into their understanding of what had happened to them. And they also began to really value uh, the mirroring of client resilience as a major part of the work. And I would say that I have experienced that as well in working with refugees and humanitarian aid workers, just the simple noticing and reflecting ways in which that client has displayed great resilience and perseverance is surprisingly very validating to them and very strengthening as they're reminded of all that they've overcome and all that they've continued to work toward. Um, Also, therapists found changes in their general belief in the practice models, um, tending to broaden their involvement. So, not always working only in individual therapy, but sometimes looking at ways that community involvement can be important or the bigger family structure can be important. Understanding, again, the ideas of healing and trauma from other perspectives. And they often moved away from traditional models of trauma work and moved more into the narrative approaches that help clients tell their stories more fully and locate this trauma story within the bigger story of their lives. And going along with this same theme, um, therapists, again, consistently reported that they began to really value and trust their client's spirituality as a resilience factor and to work with that in their clients and respect that. And a very positive view of a strengths-based approach. Like I mentioned earlier, just consistently acknowledging and verbalizing the ways in which their clients are resilient, and also using this piece of the work as a way to build the relationship itself, to reflect with clients on just how much they've overcome and what great work they've already done. Now I'm going to spend the last few minutes of our time together just on some reflection questions uh, to think through how these different areas, the four different areas of integrated research and practice might show up as we're working with clients, and just as a beginning point for us to think about how can we be more intentional about this kind of, being thoughtful about our place in the relationship and mindful of the ways in which we can grow from our time with our clients. So I just ask that you consider a trauma client with whom you've had a significant therapeutic relationship, and just give some thought to how would they describe your relationship. Did they see you as someone who would give them advice, or a confidant, an expert, just a supportive presence? What would you say? Maybe they've told you, or maybe you can kind of guess or understand from other things they've said. And do you think that they perceived you as someone who has also struggled at times? Did they see you as someone who cared about them personally? And did they worry about the effect of their story on you? What do you think they would say is the most important element of your relationship? And then, turning that back around to yourself, how do you describe the relationship? How do you define yourself in that with that particular client? How did you decide which aspects of your life to disclose to the client, if any? And did you care personally about this client? And did you feel that they cared about you as a person? How did it feel to receive this client's story? And what do you think was the most important element of your relationship? And just thinking about um, similarities and differences in the way that you and the client may have understood the relationship, at least initially. And why do you think that was? How do you understand those differences? How did you or will you navigate those differences? Um, what are the cultural pieces that you want to integrate in your work? And understanding of what the work includes. And then thinking about how our identities and those of our clients play into the work. What are the identities of that client? I've got many listed there. I'm sure there are many I'm missing. And how have these identities shaped their experiences generally in life? And how have they shaped their experiences of therapy and of you? And then asking yourself the same questions. What are your identities and how have they shaped your experience in life? How do they shape the way you understand therapy, the way you understand your relationship with that particular person? And, I think this is an area where we can also be mindful of the fact that our identities often also play into the likelihood of us experiencing trauma in our lives and also of having resources to cope with that trauma when it comes. And how does that affect the relationship that my identities factor into my probability of ever finding myself in my client's situation? And then, always being mindful of the ways in which we might be experiencing vicarious traumatization in our work. And I hope that this is something you regularly reflect on, but in this relationship that we're talking about, this particular client, did you notice any symptoms of VT in that situation or just compassion fatigue? And in your work in general, and how does that show up for you? I think that's especially important for you specifically. How do you know what is your signature for vicarious traumatization? What's your tip off that it's time to start bending yourself toward resilience? And then thinking specifically about the resilience piece, what challenges have you witnessed your client, this client we're thinking of, overcome in the therapeutic process? What have you seen in your work with them? And as you worked with them, what was stimulated in you? What did you want to nurture and expand because of their story, things that they inspired in you? This is what we want to be very mindful of. As I'm working with a client, what are the ways in which I am positively impacted by them? And in looking at how you may have been positively impacted, do you have any thoughts about how your perception of yourself may have been changed by your client's resilience? Do you feel that your general outlook on the world has changed in some way? Can you identify any impact in your own views on spirituality? Have any thoughts about how your views on trauma work been positively impacted by your clients' resilience? And do you have any thoughts about the ways you take care of yourself that are directly related to your clients' resilience? And all of this, as I was putting this together, I was thinking about a fairly recent conversation that I had with a humanitarian aid worker who works in a very difficult area of the world. And in the course of our conversation, was just talking about how much respect um, he has for the people who live in that area, their ability to remain joyful and persistent in their lives. And I had been thinking a lot about this concept and mentioned it to him, um, this idea of vicarious resilience. And he said, Shelley, uh, we would have to do this. We would have to focus on the ways in which we are positively impacted by the people going through these difficult challenges, or we would just give up. We would lose hope. And I thought that was a very nice summary of the importance of this concept for us. Okay. Well, thank you all for your time. I appreciate you um, spending time with me thinking through this concept. I think it's a really important piece of the work, and I hope that you will be mindful of it as you move forward.